When my fiancé declared, "I need a prenup, I won't gamble my future on you," I simply smiled and agreed. But I quietly had my attorney craft one that safeguarded every piece of my hard-earned success. The shock on his legal team when they discovered my assets outweighed his tenfold was a moment I'll never forget. "I need a prenup, I won't gamble my future on you." Grant said those words across a candlelit table at Marcello's, our favorite Italian restaurant, with the same tone someone might use to discuss a car lease. Not angry, not apologetic, just matter-of-fact, like he was announcing a business decision that had already been made. I set down my wine glass carefully, keeping my hand steady even though something inside me had just cracked wide open. "A prenup," I repeated, my voice calm. "Okay," he blinked, clearly surprised I wasn't crying or arguing or demanding explanations. "Wait, you're fine with it?" "Of course," I said, forcing a small smile. "It makes sense. Protecting what you've built is smart." Grant's shoulders relaxed immediately, relief flooding his face. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "God, you have no idea how worried I was. You're amazing, Paige. Most women would throw a fit, but you get it. I've worked too hard to risk it all on anyone, even someone I love." "Even someone I love." I nodded, still smiling while my mind was already 3 steps ahead. Because what Grant didn't know, what nobody knew, was that sitting across from him wasn't some modest tech consultant scraping by on a middle-class salary. Sitting across from him was a woman worth $9.5 million. And he'd just handed me the perfect opportunity to show him exactly who he'd been underestimating for 3 years. My name is Paige Calloway, and this is the story of how my fiancé's prenup demand became the biggest mistake of his life. But to understand how we got here, you need to know who I really am. Not the version Grant thinks he knows. Not the woman his mother Margaret sees at Sunday brunch. The real me. I'm 32 years old, and for the past 6 years, I've lived 2 completely separate lives. In one, I'm exactly what everyone assumes. A mid-level tech consultant who drives a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the passenger door. I live in a modest 2-bedroom apartment where the rent is reasonable and the neighbors mind their own business. I shop at Target, clip coupons occasionally, wear the same 3 pairs of jeans until they fade at the knees. To the outside world, I'm comfortable but unremarkable, safe, predictable. The kind of woman who wouldn't threaten anyone's narrative about themselves. But in my other life, the invisible one, I'm the creator of CloudSync Pro, a cloud-based inventory management system that hotels and retail chains across North America license for their operations. The software I built in my spare bedroom 6 years ago generates $52,000 in royalties every single month. That's $624,000 a year, deposited automatically into accounts Grant has never asked about. I also own 7 residential properties spread across 3 states. I started buying them when I was 27, using the first big royalty check as a down payment on a duplex in Austin, then a small apartment building in Phoenix, a trio of single-family rentals in suburban Ohio where the numbers made perfect sense. Each property was carefully selected, thoroughly researched, managed by professionals I vetted personally. Together they generate $18,000 in monthly income. My stock portfolio sits at $3.2 million. I started investing when I was 18 with money from a part-time job, back when compound interest was just a concept in my economics textbook. Now it's the foundation of a diversified portfolio that includes index funds, blue-chip stocks, and a small percentage in high-risk growth companies. I have commercial real estate holdings, a small strip mall in Tennessee that houses a coffee shop, a dry cleaner, and a tax preparation service. The tenants are stable, the location is solid, and the income is steady. My total net worth exceeds $9.5 million. And almost nobody knows. This double life wasn't born from some elaborate deception or criminal scheme. It was born from necessity, from a lesson I learned the hardest way possible when I was just 14 years old. I can still remember that night with perfect, painful clarity. I was supposed to be asleep, but voices had woken me, my mother's rising in pitch and cracking with tears, my father's low and defensive. I crept to the top of the stairs in my pajamas, clutching my stuffed rabbit, peering through the banister spindles at the scene unfolding in our living room. My mother was holding bank statements, her hands shaking so badly the papers rustled audibly even from where I sat. $17,000, David. You spent $17,000 without telling me. It was an investment, my father said, his voice tight and strained. The market was hot. I was trying to build something for us. You were trying to prove something to your brother. My mother shot back, and even at 14 I could hear the years of resentment compressed into those words. Because he bought that lake house and you couldn't stand being the less successful one. The argument escalated from there, money becoming the language through which every disappointment, every failure, every crack in their marriage was expressed. Joint accounts became battlegrounds. Shared assets became weapons. The house they'd bought together became a prize to be divided. Savings meant for my college fund became leverage in negotiations. I watched my mother sob into her hands while my father grabbed his keys and walked out the door with nothing but his wounded pride. The divorce took 2 years to finalize, 2 years of lawyers and mediators and arguments over who deserved what. By the end, there was nothing left of what they'd once had except legal documents and bitter resentment. That night on the stairs, still clutching my rabbit, I made myself a promise. I would never let money define my relationships. I would never let it become a weapon. And I would never, ever let someone think they loved me when what they really loved was what I could provide. So when I sold my first licensing agreement for CloudSync Pro at 26, fresh out of a relationship with a man who'd suddenly become very interested in my career potential, the moment money entered the picture, I made a decision. I would keep my success quiet. I would live modestly, dress simply, drive an unremarkable car. I would let people see me, just me, before they saw the numbers in my bank account. It worked beautifully for years. I maintained my part-time consulting job, keeping up appearances, staying connected to normal life. I made friends who knew nothing about my real financial situation. I dated occasionally, always keeping the conversation away from specifics about income or assets. Then, 3 years ago, I met Grant Harrison. We were both at my friend Jessica's wedding, seated at the singles table. That awkward collection of unattached friends and distant cousins the bride and groom hope might pair off and make the seating chart easier next time. Grant was magnetic in a way I hadn't encountered before. Confident without seeming arrogant, ambitious without being ruthless. The kind of man who could tell a story about a difficult client and make it genuinely entertaining. He ran a boutique real estate consultancy called Harrison & Associates. He had business cards with embossed lettering, a polished LinkedIn profile, 3 part-time associates who handled overflow work. He drove a leased Audi Q5, wore what I later learned was a finance Tag Heuer watch, and lived in a trendy industrial loft in the revitalized warehouse district. His business was legitimate but struggling. He had 15 active clients, but at least half of them paid late or haggled over invoices. His overhead, the fancy office space, the associate salaries, the software subscriptions, the marketing, consumed most of his profit. But Grant had mastered something more valuable than actual success. He'd mastered the performance of it, the confidence, the presentation, the ability to walk into a room and make people believe he was exactly who he appeared to be. I admired that hustle, that determination to project strength even when things were uncertain. It reminded me of my own journey, building something from nothing, believing in it before anyone else did. But what I admired even more, what drew me to him in a way I didn't fully understand at first, was that he never asked about my finances. When I told him I was a tech consultant, he accepted it without question. He never pressed for details about my salary, never asked about my apartment or my car or why I always suggested inexpensive restaurants for our dates. He simply assumed I was comfortable but unremarkable, a safe, stable partner who wouldn't threaten his carefully constructed narrative of being the provider, the successful one. And I let him believe it, because for the first time in years someone was looking at me. Just me, not my potential, not what I could offer. Not the possibilities my bank account might represent, just Paige, the woman who laughed at his jokes, who listened to his dreams about expanding his consultancy, who showed up to his business dinners and smiled at his associates and made him feel supported. It felt safe. It felt normal. It felt real. For 3 years we built a comfortable rhythm together. Grant would come home from client meetings energized and animated, telling me about deals he'd landed, often exaggerating their value or timeline. I'd later realize. I'd listen, ask questions, celebrate with him over takeout pizza or cheap wine. My own professional life remained deliberately vague. Consulting work, I'd say if anyone asked. Some tech stuff for small businesses. Pretty boring, honestly. Nobody pushed for details. Nobody seemed particularly interested. I attended Sunday brunches with his mother Margaret, a sharp-tongued woman who'd worked her way up from a working-class childhood and had strong opinions about everything, especially about what constituted a good match for her son. She'd smile at me over mimosas and homemade quiche and say things like, "It's so wonderful that Grant found someone grounded, Paige. So many young women today are obsessed with status and money." I'd smile back, nod, say nothing, play the role perfectly. The supportive girlfriend, the uncomplicated partner, the woman who was just successful enough to be interesting but not so successful that she'd threaten the delicate balance of Grant's self-image. And it worked. For 3 years it worked beautifully, until it didn't. The shift started so subtly I almost missed it. About 6 months ago, Grant began making comments about our future, always with an undertone of financial anxiety threading through his words. When we're married, we'll need to be smart about money, he'd say over dinner at our favorite Thai place, his tone casual but his eyes serious. My dad lost everything in his divorce. The house, half his savings, everything. I won't make the same mistakes. I'd reassure him, thinking these were normal pre-marriage concerns. Every couple worried about finances, right? Every person brought some baggage from their parents' relationships into their own. But the comments grew more frequent, more pointed, more specific. He started mentioning friends who'd been destroyed by divorces, talking about prenups as if they were obvious common sense rather than relationship landmines. He'd reference articles he'd read about financial boundaries in marriage, lawyers who specialized in asset protection, the importance of keeping what you've earned. Each comment was small on its own, insignificant, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. Grant wasn't just anxious about our future together, he was preparing for our ending. And sitting here at Marcello's, watching him relax now that I'd agreed to his prenup, watching him signal the waiter for another bottle of wine like we were celebrating, I realized something with absolute clarity. Grant had no idea who he was actually protecting himself from. He had no idea that the biggest financial threat in this relationship wasn't me taking something from him. It was him discovering I'd never needed anything from him in the first place. Grant signaled the waiter for another bottle of wine, his whole demeanor transformed now that I'd agreed to his terms. The tension that had drawn his shoulders tight all evening melted away, replaced by the easy confidence I'd fallen for 3 years ago. You know what? He said, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied smile. This is exactly why I knew you were the one. You're rational, practical. You don't let emotions cloud your judgment. I took a sip of water, letting the irony of his words settle between us like the candlelight flickering on our table. Rational, practical. If only he knew how practical I was about to become. When do you want to move forward with this? I asked, keeping my voice light, curious. My lawyer's already drafting the paperwork, Grant said, and something in his tone made my stomach tighten. Already drafting, which meant he'd made this decision before tonight, before asking me, before giving me any say in the matter. This dinner wasn't a conversation, it was a notification. He'll have something ready by early next week. We can review it together, make sure you're comfortable with everything. Make sure I'm comfortable. The phrasing was almost amusing. Sounds good, I said, cutting into my pasta primavera even though my appetite had vanished somewhere around the time he'd called our marriage a gamble. I'll have my lawyer look it over too. Grant's fork paused halfway to his mouth. You have a lawyer? The surprise in his voice was telling. Of course he'd assumed I didn't have legal representation. Why would someone like me, someone he perceived as financially simple, need an attorney on retainer? For work stuff, I said casually, which wasn't technically a lie. Eleanor did handle my business contracts, among many other things, just to make sure I understand all the legal language. Right, yeah, that makes sense, Grant said, recovering quickly. Smart. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, but sure, have them take a look. Pretty straightforward. I wondered if he'd still think that in a week. We finished dinner with small talk about wedding plans, his mother's insistence on inviting her entire book club, whether we should do a honeymoon in Greece or Italy. Grant was animated again, laughing, planning, as if the prenup conversation had been nothing more than a minor administrative detail we'd checked off a list. When we left the restaurant, the rain had started. Not a downpour, just a steady drizzle that made the streetlights blur and the pavement shine. Grant kissed me on the cheek, not the lips, I noticed, and said he had an early client meeting that he'd call me tomorrow. I watched his Audi pull away from the curb, taillights disappearing into the wet darkness, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. Not heartbreak exactly, something colder, more clarifying. I sat in my Honda for 20 minutes, rain drumming against the windshield in a rhythm that matched my pulse. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I kept replaying his words. I won't gamble my future on you. Not we, not us, not our future together. Your future, my risk. Finally, I pulled out my phone and dialed Eleanor Houghton. She answered on the second ring, her voice sharp and alert despite it being nearly 11 at night. Tell me he finally did it. Eleanor had been my attorney for 8 years. Ever since I'd needed someone to handle the legal complexities of my first major licensing agreement. She was 52, whip-smart, ruthlessly efficient, and one of only 3 people who knew the full scope of my financial situation. We'd become friends over the years, bonding over terrible courthouse coffee and her endless stories about the absurdity of family law. He did, I said quietly, staring at the rain streaking down my windshield. He wants a prenup. There was a pause, then a low, dangerous chuckle that I felt in my chest. And I assume he thinks he's the one with something to protect? He said, and I quote, I won't gamble my future on you. Eleanor's laugh was sharp and cold. Oh, Paige, this is going to be delicious. Tell me everything. I recounted the entire dinner, The tension, the rehearsed speech, his relief when I agreed, his comment about his lawyer already drafting paperwork. Eleanor listened without interrupting, and I could practically hear her mind working through the implications. "So he's been planning this for a while," she said when I finished. "This wasn't spontaneous anxiety. This was calculated. Seems like it. And he has no idea what he's actually asking for?" "None." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into what I called her strategic mode: cool, precise, lethal. "Here's what we're going to do. I'll draft a counterproposal that looks completely reasonable on the surface. Everything he wants: separate property stays separate, clean division of assets, all that standard prenup language. But we're adding one critical clause." "What clause?" "Full financial disclosure from both parties. Complete transparency. Tax returns, asset lists, debt obligations, investment portfolios, everything on the table. If he wants to protect what's his, then both of you need to know exactly what that means." I felt something like a smile pull at my lips for the first time all evening. "He's going to agree to that. He thinks it protects him." "Exactly," Eleanor said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "Let him think he's being thorough. Let him think he's covering all his bases. And then we show him the truth he was too arrogant to ask about for 3 years." We talked for another 10 minutes, Eleanor asking questions about timeline, about whether I wanted to include specific protections for my intellectual property, about how detailed we should make the disclosure requirements. By the time we hung up, I felt steadier, more in control. The rain had intensified, turning into a proper downpour that made visibility nearly impossible. I started the car and drove home carefully, the windshield wipers working overtime, my mind already 3 steps ahead. 3 days later, Grant's proposed prenup arrived in my email inbox. I was at my apartment, working from home on a client project that didn't require much mental energy, when the notification appeared on my screen. The subject line was simple: "Prenup draft review at your convenience." Review at your convenience. Like he was sending over restaurant recommendations. I saved the file, made myself a cup of tea, and settled onto my couch with my laptop. The document was 17 pages long, formatted in that dense legal language that makes everything sound both important and incomprehensible at the same time. I started reading. By page 3 my jaw was tight. By page 7 I'd set down my tea because my hands were shaking. By page 17 I understood exactly what Grant thought of me. Clause 4. In the event of divorce, any jointly purchased property, including but not limited to real estate, vehicles, and household goods, defaults to Grant Harrison's sole ownership unless Paige Calloway can provide documented proof of contributing more than 60% of the purchase price. 60%, not 50. Not even a fair split. I would have to prove I'd paid more than half just to claim any ownership of things we supposedly bought together. Clause 7. Paige Calloway hereby waives all rights to spousal support, alimony, or any form of financial maintenance in the event of divorce, regardless of the length of marriage or circumstances of separation. I waive everything, no matter what. Even if we were married 30 years. Even if he cheated, lied, abandoned me. Nothing. Clause 9. The engagement ring, valued at $8,500, remains the sole property of Grant Harrison and must be returned to him within 30 days of separation, annulment, or divorce. I stared at that clause for a full minute, something cold and bitter settling in my chest. The ring on my finger, the symbol of his love, his commitment, his promise, was classified as loanable property, like a library book. Like something he was letting me borrow until I failed to meet his expectations. There were more clauses, provisions about how any inheritance I received would be considered marital property, but any inheritance he received would remain solely his. Stipulations about how any business I might start during our marriage would be subject to his approval and partial ownership. Requirements that any financial decisions over $500 required his written consent. This wasn't a prenuptial agreement. This was a cage. A legal structure designed to keep me small, dependent, powerless. Grant hadn't just protected himself from a gold digger. He'd constructed an entire framework to ensure I could never threaten his narrative of being the successful one, the provider, the person in control. He'd built a prison for someone who didn't exist and asked me to walk into it willingly. I read through the document one more time, making notes in the margins, highlighting the most egregious clauses. Then I forwarded it to Eleanor without adding a single word of commentary. My phone rang 6 minutes later. Is he out of his goddamn mind? Eleanor's voice was ice and fire combined. Paige, this isn't a prenup. This is financial abuse dressed up in legal language. If you sign this, you'd have zero protection. Less than zero. I know. I said quietly. He's treating you like you're a gold digger while simultaneously setting up a structure that would let him take everything from you. The hypocrisy is actually breathtaking. I laughed, but it came out hollow. What do? We do exactly what I told you, Eleanor said, and her voice shifted back into that strategic precision I'd come to trust completely. We draft our counter-proposal, fair, reasonable, professional, and we require full financial disclosure from both parties. Let's see how confident Mr. Harrison is when the cards are actually on the table. When can you have it ready? Friday. I'll messenger it over to his lawyer's office. Schedule the signing for early next week if they're amenable. Eleanor. Yeah, thank you. Her voice softened slightly. Paige, you're about to give this man the education of his lifetime. It's going to be my absolute pleasure to help. We hung up and I sat in the quiet of my apartment, the prenup still glowing on my laptop screen, and felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years. Power. Grant thought he was protecting himself. He thought he was being smart, careful, strategic. He had no idea that the woman he'd underestimated for so long was about to show him exactly who she was. And there would be no going back from that revelation. The days that followed felt surreal, like I was living in 2 timelines simultaneously. In one timeline, everything was normal. Grant texted me good morning messages with coffee cup emojis. He sent me links to potential honeymoon resorts in Santorini, asking which one I preferred. He called during his lunch breaks to tell me about a new client he'd landed, his voice animated and proud. He was planning our future like the prenup had been nothing more than a minor formality, a box checked, a problem solved. In the other timeline, the real one, I was preparing for war. Eleanor worked fast. By Friday afternoon, she'd messengered our counterproposal to Richard Brennan, Grant's attorney. The document was a masterpiece of legal precision. Everything Grant wanted on the surface, wrapped in language that sounded cooperative and reasonable. Separate property remains separate. Clean division of assets. No claims on premarital wealth. But buried in Section 8, subsection C, was the clause that would change everything. Both parties agreed to provide complete and verified financial disclosure, including but not limited to tax returns for the previous 5 years, statements for all bank accounts, investment portfolios, real estate holdings, business valuations, and any other assets exceeding $5,000 in value. Grant's lawyer would see it as standard due diligence. Grant himself probably wouldn't even read that far into the document before signing. And that was exactly what we were counting on. The week between sending our counterproposal and the scheduled signing became an exercise in emotional compartmentalization. I went to work, conducted client meetings, responded to emails about CloudSync Pro updates. I had dinner with Grant twice, once at his loft, once at a new sushi place he wanted to try. I smiled, laughed at his jokes, discussed whether we should register for the expensive stand mixer or the mid-range one. But I was watching him now, really watching, and I was seeing things I'd trained myself not to notice for 3 years. The way he always ordered the most expensive wine at restaurants, then complained about the cost of groceries when we shopped together. How he'd casually mention the price of his watch or his suit or his shoes to the waiter, the valet, anyone who might be impressed. How he positioned himself in group photos to be central, visible, important. On Wednesday night, I attended a dinner with some of his business associates at an upscale steakhouse downtown. Grant held court at the head of the table, describing a major deal he was closing next week with a commercial developer. I knew from his earlier venting sessions that the developer was still months away from making any decisions, but Grant told the story like it was already done. Harrison and Associates is expanding, he announced, his second bourbon loosening his tongue. We're looking at bringing on 2 more full-time associates, maybe opening a satellite office in Denver. His business partner, a quiet man named Tom, glanced at me with barely concealed confusion. I'd heard Tom on speakerphone just last week telling Grant they couldn't afford new hires until at least 3 more clients came through. But Grant was performing, and everyone at that table was his audience, including me. I used to find his confidence attractive. Now I saw it for what it really was, a desperate need to be perceived as successful regardless of the reality beneath. When I got home that night, I sat in my parked car outside my apartment building for 10 minutes, my hands resting on the steering wheel, my mind turning over a question I'd been avoiding. Had I ever really known him? Or had I just loved the version of himself he'd performed for me? Saturday morning, my sister Maya called. So, she said, her voice bright with curiosity, Grant wants a prenup? That's actually really mature of him. Most guys are too proud to even bring it up. I was making coffee in my small kitchen, the morning sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment I considered keeping it light, giving her the sanitized version. But Maya was the only family member who knew about my real financial situation. I'd told her 2 years ago when she'd asked to borrow money for a down payment on her first house. "Yeah, he wants a prenup," I said carefully. "But Maya, you should see what his lawyer drafted." "Why? Is it bad?" I told her about the clauses, the 60% provision, the alimony waiver, the engagement ring classified as returnable property. With each detail, the silence on her end grew heavier. "Wait," Maya finally said, her voice sharp. "He's treating you like you're after his money? Paige, you could buy his entire business twice over and still have money left for a villa in Tuscany." We both laughed, but it came out bitter and hollow. "This is insane," Maya continued. "Does he have any idea who you actually are?" "None." "Are you going to tell him?" I stared out my kitchen window at the building across the street, watching a woman water plants on her balcony, living her simple Saturday morning. "I'm going to show him," I said quietly. "There's a difference." Maya was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more serious. "Paige, are you sure about this? Once he knows, you can't unknow it. This is going to change everything." "It's already changed," I said. "He just doesn't realize it yet." "Okay," Maya said. "Then let him see who he's been underestimating. Let him see exactly who he tried to cage." After we hung up, I felt something crystallize inside me. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about humiliation. This was about truth. For 3 years, I'd hidden myself to see if Grant would love me without the complication of money. And he had, he'd loved the version of me that fit his narrative. The supportive girlfriend, the modest partner, the woman who made him feel successful by comparison. But he'd never loved the real me because he'd never bothered to ask who that was. The signing was scheduled for Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. The night before, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying our entire relationship like a film reel I couldn't shut off. Our first date at that coffee shop near the pier, Grant telling me about his dreams of building a real estate empire, his eyes bright with ambition. The weekend trip to the mountains where he'd taught me to ski, patient and encouraging when I kept falling. The night he'd proposed on that beach in Santa Barbara, the sunset turning everything golden, his voice trembling slightly as he asked me to marry him. Had any of it been real? Or had it all been performance? His performance, my performance, both of us playing roles we thought the other wanted to see? I thought about my parents' marriage, how money had poisoned everything it touched, how my mother had cried over bank statements while my father defended investments he'd made to prove something to his brother, how love had been translated into legal language, reduced to line items and asset divisions. I'd sworn I would never repeat that pattern. I'd sworn money would never define my relationships. But here I was, about to walk into a law office where our love, or whatever had passed for it, would be reduced to clauses and signatures and financial disclosures. The difference was, this time I wasn't the victim. This time I was the one holding all the cards Grant didn't know existed. I finally fell asleep around 3 in the morning. My last conscious thought a strange mix of sadness and anticipation. Tomorrow Grant would finally see me clearly. Not as the modest girlfriend he'd underestimated. Not as the safe partner who wouldn't threaten his narrative. But as the woman he should have asked about from the beginning. The woman who'd been there all along, waiting for him to care enough to look. When my alarm went off at 7, I felt oddly calm. I showered, dressed in a simple navy dress and blazer. Professional but not flashy. I ate breakfast even though I wasn't hungry, knowing I'd need the energy. Eleanor texted at 9, "Ready to make history?" I texted back, "Ready." Grant called at 11, his voice cheerful. "Hey, still good for 2 o'clock?" My lawyer confirmed everything's set. "I'll be there," I said. "Perfect. This'll be quick and painless, then we can grab an early dinner. There's that new French place I've been wanting to try." Quick and painless. I almost laughed. "Sounds good," I said instead. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I didn't drink, watching the clock tick toward 2 o'clock. In a few hours, everything would change. Grant thought he was protecting himself, securing his assets, being smart and strategic. He had no idea that the woman he'd demanded financial transparency from was about to give him exactly what he'd asked for. And it would destroy everything he thought he knew. I arrived at Brennan and Associates at exactly 1:50. The building was one of those downtown high-rises that screamed corporate power. All glass and steel and reflective surfaces designed to make you feel small before you even walk through the door. The lobby had marble floors that amplified every footstep, abstract art that probably cost more than most people's cars, and a security desk where I had to sign in and get a visitor badge. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt like ascending to an execution chamber. I checked my reflection in the polished steel doors. Navy dress, simple blazer, minimal jewelry. I looked exactly like what Grant expected, professional but modest, presentable but unremarkable. The woman who wouldn't make waves. The doors opened to reveal a reception area that matched the building's aesthetic. More glass, more steel. A receptionist with perfect makeup and a smile that didn't reach her eyes directed me to conference room B. Grant was already there when I walked in. He stood immediately, his whole face lighting up with relief and affection. He looked good, freshly shaved, wearing his charcoal suit that I knew he reserved for important client meetings, his cologne subtle but expensive. He crossed the room and kissed me on the cheek, his hand warm on my arm. "Hey," he said softly. "You look great." A little nervous. A little, I admitted, which was true, though not for the reasons he thought. "Don't be. This is going to be quick and painless. Just some signatures, then we can put this whole thing behind us and focus on the fun stuff. Wedding planning, honeymoon, all of it. Quick and painless." I held on to those words, wondering if he'd remember saying them an hour from now. Richard Brennan entered moments later, mid-50s, silver hair perfectly styled, a suit that probably cost $3,000. The kind of lawyer who made a career out of making wealthy men feel protected. He shook my hand with the grip of someone who'd perfected the art of seeming sincere. "Miss Calloway, pleasure to meet you. Grant's told me wonderful things. This should be very straightforward." Straightforward. Everyone kept using that word. We settled into chairs around a long conference table. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city sprawling below us, storm clouds gathering in the distance. The room smelled like furniture polish and expensive leather. Then Eleanor arrived. I heard her before I saw her. The sharp click of heels against marble, precise and rhythmic like a countdown timer. She walked into the conference room carrying a single leather portfolio, her expression unreadable, her red lipstick a deliberate slash of color against her otherwise neutral palette. Richard stood, extending his hand. "Ms. Houghton." "Pleasure." Eleanor's smile was razor-thin. "Mr. Brennan, shall we begin?" There was something in the way she said it, polite on the surface, but underneath I caught the edge of controlled anticipation, like a chess player sitting down to a game they already know they'll win. We all took our seats, Grant beside me, Eleanor on my other side, Richard across from us, spreading documents across the table with practiced efficiency. "Let's start with Mr. Harrison's financial disclosures," Richard said, opening a thin folder. "Full transparency as requested." He laid out each document like he was presenting evidence, which, in a way, he was. Grant's business valuation for Harrison and Associates, $340,000. I knew from overheard phone conversations that this number was inflated, based on projected earnings rather than actual revenue. His condo, purchased for $550,000, current mortgage balance $420,000. His Audi Q5, leased at $680 per month. His investment accounts, $87,000 in mutual funds, most of it inherited from his grandfather. Richard presented each item with the confidence of someone who believed these numbers were impressive. And to most people they probably would be. Grant was doing fine. Better than fine by normal standards. Grant himself sat back in his chair, arms crossed, radiating quiet confidence. This was his moment. The successful businessman, the provider, the man who'd built something worth protecting. He glanced at me once, offering a small reassuring smile like he was saying, "See? Nothing to worry about." Richard slid the prenup document across the table, Grant's original version, the one with all those devastating clauses. "Standard terms," he said smoothly. "Separate property remains separate. No alimony provisions. Clean division in the event of, well, the unlikely event of dissolution." Very straightforward. Grant nodded, his expression satisfied. In his mind this was already over. We'd sign, shake hands, maybe take a photo to commemorate being responsible adults. Then dinner at that French place, wine, celebration. He had no idea what was about to happen. Eleanor didn't touch the document Richard had pushed toward us. Instead she opened her portfolio with deliberate, almost theatrical calm, and pulled out a significantly thicker file. "We've prepared a counter-proposal," she said, her voice clinical and professional, every word precisely articulated. "My client agrees to most of Mr. Harrison's terms with one minor adjustment." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. "Adjustment. Both parties must provide complete financial disclosure." Eleanor's tone remained perfectly neutral, like she was discussing the weather. "Tax returns for the previous 5 years, statements for all accounts, investment portfolios, real estate holdings, business interests." The full picture. Richard frowned, glancing at the documents he'd already presented. We've already provided Mr. Harrison's financial disclosures. Mr. Harrison has provided his disclosures, Eleanor interrupted smoothly, her voice pleasant but firm. Miss Calloway has not. Grant turned to me, confusion flickering across his face, followed by something that looked like annoyance. Paige, you don't need to. I mean, we're not trying to make this complicated. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something inside me go very still and very quiet. Actually, I do, I said softly. If we're going to be transparent, let's be completely transparent. Eleanor slid the folder across the table. It landed with a thud that seemed to reverberate through the entire room, heavy with implications Grant couldn't yet understand. Richard opened it. I watched his expression shift in real time, professional neutrality cracking into confusion, then widening into shock, then settling into something close to panic. His lips moved silently as he scanned the first page, then flipped to the second, then the third, his eyes darting faster and faster across the numbers. Grant, impatient now, reached over and grabbed one of the sheets from the folder. The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might actually faint. What? His voice came out barely above a whisper. What is this? I met his eyes, keeping my own voice steady, calm. My financial disclosure. Exactly what you asked for. Eleanor's voice cut through the silence, clinical and precise. Ms. Calloway is the creator of CloudSync Pro, a cloud-based inventory management system currently licensed by major hotel chains and retail operations across North America. The software generates $52,000 monthly in licensing fees. Stop. Grant's voice cracked like breaking glass, but Eleanor continued, relentless. She owns 7 rental properties across 3 states, producing $18,000 in monthly income. Her investment portfolio is valued at $3.2 million. Her commercial real estate holdings generate an additional. I said stop. Grant was on his feet now, his chair scraping violently against the floor, the sound harsh and discordant in the quiet conference room. He was staring at me like I'd suddenly become a stranger, like the woman he'd been sitting next to had been replaced by someone he'd never seen before. Paige. My name came out jagged, confused, almost pleading. This can't be real. It's real, I said quietly. Verified and documented. Every number in that folder has supporting documentation. Tax returns, bank statements, property deeds, licensing agreements. It's all there. Grant's hands trembled as he flipped through more pages, his breathing getting faster, shallower. You've been lying to me this whole time? You let me believe. I never lied, I interrupted gently but firmly. You never asked. Never asked. His voice rose, cracking with emotion. You let me think I was. You sat there for 3 years while He couldn't finish. His face was cycling through emotions so quickly I could barely track them. Betrayal, humiliation, bigger. Richard cleared his throat, trying desperately to regain some professional composure. Perhaps we should take a brief recess too. No. Grant's voice was sharp, wounded. He turned to me, his eyes searching my face like he was trying to find something he recognized. Why didn't you tell me? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with everything we'd never said to each other. Because I wanted you to love me, I said, and my voice came out smaller than I'd intended, more vulnerable. Not my bank account. Grant's jaw clenched. That's not. Everyone's going to think I'm marrying up. They'll think I'm some kind of. He couldn't say it, but I heard it anyway. Gold digger, the kept man. All the things his prenup had been designed to protect him from being seen as. And there was not heartbreak, not betrayal, not even anger at being deceived. Embarrassment. Grant wasn't hurt that I'd kept a secret. He was humiliated that I'd made him look small. Eleanor closed her folder with a soft snap that sounded like a judge's gavel. The silence in that conference room was absolute, and I knew with complete certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The silence in that conference room stretched so long I could hear the air conditioning vent humming overhead. Grant was still standing, his hand gripping the back of his chair so hard his knuckles had gone white. The papers from my financial disclosure were scattered across the table where he'd dropped them, property deeds and licensing agreements and bank statements creating a paper trail of everything he'd never bothered to ask about. Richard Brennan was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled, professional training overriding his obvious discomfort. Perhaps we should take a brief recess to review these documents more thoroughly and reconvene. No. Grant's voice came out sharp, almost violent in the quiet room. I need to understand this, right now. He turned to me and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly. Something rawer than that. More desperate. Why? The single word came out strangled. Why didn't you tell me? I took a breath, choosing my words carefully. Because I wanted you to love me, not my bank account. That's not. He stopped, his jaw working like he was physically chewing on words he couldn't quite say. Everyone's going to think I'm marrying up. My clients, my business partners, my mother. They'll all think I'm some kind of. He couldn't finish, couldn't say the word out loud. Wait, gold digger. The exact things his prenup had been designed to protect him from being perceived as. Grant, I said quietly, this doesn't have to change anything. We can still. Doesn't have to change anything? His laugh was sharp and bitter. Paige, you've been sitting on nearly $10 million while I've been. He gestured wildly at his own disclosure documents. While I've been bragging about landing a $20,000 client like it's some major achievement. Do you have any idea how that makes me look? There it was again. How it made him look. Not how it made him feel. Not what it meant for our relationship. Just the optics. The performance. Eleanor stood smoothly, her expression professionally neutral. If you'd like to proceed with a fair, balanced prenup that protects both parties equally, we can draft new terms that. Otherwise nothing, Grant snapped, grabbing his jacket from where it hung on the back of his chair. His movements were jerky, uncontrolled, like a marionette with tangled strings. I need air. I can't. I need to get out of here. He moved toward the door. Richard Brennan jumped to his feet, papers scattering. Grant, we really should discuss the next steps before. But Grant was already gone, yanking the conference room door open and disappearing into the hallway. The door slammed behind him with a crack so sharp I flinched. Richard stood frozen for a moment, his face flushed, clearly torn between maintaining professional composure and chasing after his client. Finally, he turned to us, attempting to smooth his expression into something appropriately apologetic. I sincerely apologize for my client's reaction, he said, his voice tight. This information is unexpected. We'll need some time to process and discuss how to proceed. Eleanor's expression didn't shift. Of course, we'll await your response, Mr. Brennan. Richard gathered his papers with hands that weren't quite steady, mumbled another apology and left. The door clicked shut behind him with a finality that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room. Eleanor sank back into her chair, and for the first time since we'd arrived, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Well, she said, that went better than expected. I couldn't move. I sat staring at the scattered papers across the conference table, Grant's modest financial disclosures on one side, my extensive documentation on the other, like competing stories about who we were and what we'd built. My hands were shaking. I hid them under the table, pressing my palms against my thighs, trying to steady myself. For 6 years I'd hidden my wealth. For 3 years with Grant specifically. All because I'd wanted to be loved for myself, not for what I could provide. I'd wanted someone to see me, just me, before they saw the numbers. And Grant had. Sort of. He'd seen the version of me that fit comfortably into his narrative. The supportive girlfriend. The modest partner. The woman who made him feel successful by comparison. But watching him discover the truth, watching his entire self-image crumble in real time, I realized something that made my chest ache. Money didn't just reveal people. It destroyed the masks they'd spent years perfecting. Anne Grant's mask, the confident entrepreneur, the successful provider, the man in control, had just shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Paige. Eleanor's voice broke through my thoughts, softer now, concerned. Are you all right? I looked up at her. My eyes were dry, but I felt hollowed out, like someone had scooped everything vital out of my chest and left just the shell. I don't know, I said honestly. I thought I'd feel vindicated, or satisfied, or something, but I just feel empty. Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed my hand briefly. That's normal. You just ended a relationship even if it needed to end. Give yourself permission to grieve that. Did I end it? I asked. Or did he? Does it matter? I thought about that. I guess not. Eleanor started gathering the papers, organizing them back into neat folders with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. What happens now is up to you. Grant might come back, try to salvage this, or he might not. Either way, you need to decide what you want. What did I want? A week ago I'd wanted to marry Grant. I'd wanted the life we'd been planning, the wedding, the honeymoon, the future together. But that future had been built on a foundation of assumptions that no longer existed. I drove home in a daze, barely remembering the route. My apartment felt too quiet, too empty. I made tea I didn't drink. I stared at my phone like it might ring, even though I wasn't sure I wanted it to. It didn't. That night passed. Then the next day. Then the day after that. Grant's silence was absolute. No calls. No texts. Nothing. Maya texted. How did it go? I stared at the message for 5 minutes before typing back. Tell you later. My mother left a voicemail about wedding invitations, asking if we'd finalized the guest list yet. I deleted it without responding. I went to work, conducted meetings, reviewed contracts for CloudSync Pro, responded to tenant issues at one of my rental properties. I functioned, but it felt like I was watching myself from a distance, like I was an actress playing the role of Paige Calloway going through her normal life. On the third day, I was leaving my apartment building to grab groceries when my phone buzzed. Grant's name appeared on the screen and my heart did something complicated, jumped and sank simultaneously. The message was short, almost curt. *, we need to talk. My place, tomorrow, 7 p.m. *. I stared at those words. No, please. No, when you're ready. Just a command, like he still had some authority over me, over us, over whatever this was. Part of me wanted to refuse. To text back, no, and let that be the end of it. To let our relationship die quietly, without drama, without confrontation. But another part, the part that had loved him for 3 years, that had said yes when he proposed on that beach, that still remembered what it felt like when things were good, that part needed to know what he'd say. I stood on the sidewalk outside my building, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Finally I typed, "Hey." I sent it before I could talk myself out of it. His response came immediately, "Thank you." I shoved my phone in my pocket and walked toward the grocery store, but I couldn't remember what I'd planned to buy. My mind was already jumping ahead to tomorrow night, imagining the conversation we'd have, preparing for whatever Grant was going to say. Would he apologize, demand an explanation, try to salvage the relationship? Or would he do what I suspected he might, try to make this my fault somehow, twist the narrative until he was the victim and I was the deceiver? I didn't know. But tomorrow at 7 I'd find out. The sky overhead was heavy with clouds that hadn't quite decided whether to rain, the air thick with the promise of a storm that might or might not come. I felt the same way, balanced on the edge of something, waiting to see which way I'd fall. The next evening I stood outside Grant's building at exactly 7 o'clock, staring up at the industrial loft conversion that had always seemed so impressive when we first started dating. All exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of place that screamed urban success even if the mortgage was crushing you. I took a breath and went inside. Grant answered the door within seconds of my knock, like he'd been waiting right there. He looked terrible. His eyes were red-rimmed, shadowed with dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights. His hair wasn't styled the way he usually wore it. He was in jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt. I'd rarely seen him in anything so casual, so unpolished. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice hoarse. Not warm, not cold, just strained. He didn't kiss me. Didn't even try, just stepped aside to let me in. The loft was immaculate as always, everything in its place. The expensive minimalist furniture arranged just so, the abstract art on the exposed brick walls, the industrial lighting casting carefully designed shadows. It looked like a magazine spread. It had always looked like a magazine spread. I wondered, not for the first time, how much of Grant's life was performance. We sat on opposite ends of his leather couch, a distance that felt deliberate, symbolic. Grant poured himself a whiskey from the decanter on his coffee table, expensive scotch, the kind he kept for impressing clients. He didn't offer me one. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. I could hear the ambient noise of the city through the windows, traffic, distant sirens, the hum of life continuing outside this strange, frozen moment. Finally, Grant spoke. "Paige, I've been thinking." He stared into his glass like it might contain answers. "About us. About everything that happened in that conference room." I waited, saying nothing. "I was shocked," he continued. "Obviously. I mean, you have to understand, finding out the person you thought you knew is actually someone completely different. That's a lot to process." "I'm not someone different," I said quietly. "I'm the same person I've always been. You just didn't know everything about me." "Exactly." He seized on that, leaning forward. "You didn't tell me. For 3 years, Paige. 3 years of hiding something that fundamental. You never asked." "I shouldn't have to ask." His voice rose, then he caught himself, took a breath, visibly trying to calm down. "But look, I've had 3 days to think about this. And I've realized something." He set down his glass and turned to face me fully. "I still want to marry you." My heart did something complicated, jumped and sank at the same time. Hope flickered in my chest, foolish and unwanted. A spark I immediately tried to smother because I knew, somehow, that whatever came next wouldn't be what I wanted to hear. "I love you," Grant continued, and his voice had taken on that earnest quality he used when pitching to clients. "What we have, it's real. It's valuable. And I don't want to throw that away because of money." I waited for the but. It came. "But I need you to understand my position." He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized as stress. "My business, my reputation, my relationships with clients and investors, they're all built on a certain perception. And if people find out that I'm marrying someone who's worth 10 times what I am, that perception changes." "How does it change?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I'll look weak," he said bluntly, "like I couldn't make it on my own, like I needed someone to prop me up financially. My clients will wonder if you're funding my business. My competitors will use it against me. My mother will. He stopped himself. Your mother will what? He shook his head. It doesn't matter. The point is I found a solution. A way we can make this work. The hope that had flickered moments ago died completely, replaced by something cold and knowing. What solution? I asked, though part of me didn't want to hear it. Grant started pacing, his thinking mode, his planning mode. We sign an NDA. A non-disclosure agreement about your financial situation. Nobody has to know. We can present ourselves as equals, two professionals building a life together. No awkward questions, no judgment, no complications. I stared at him. You want me to sign an NDA? About my own life. Not about your life, he said quickly. Just about the financial specifics. The numbers. The properties. All of that stays private between us. Grant. I kept my voice level, though my hands were clenched in my lap. That's not privacy. That's asking me to lie. It's discretion. He was getting animated now, gesturing with his hands like he was presenting a business proposal. Lots of wealthy people keep their finances private. It's actually the smart thing to do. Protects you from people who might try to take advantage. Like you. The words came out sharper than I intended. He froze. That's not fair, isn't it? I stood up, needing to move, needing space. You're asking me to legally bind myself to hiding who I am so your ego stays intact. How is that not taking advantage? His face flushed. You don't understand what it's like. My clients, my investors, even my family, they all see me a certain way. If they find out I'm marrying someone richer, more successful, he couldn't finish, his throat working around words he couldn't quite say. They'll think you're weak, I said quietly. They'll think you couldn't make it on your own. They'll think you're riding my coattails. Yes. The admission burst out of him. Yes, that's exactly what they'll think. And it doesn't matter that it's not true, Paige. Perception is reality in business. You should know that. I watched him pace, watched him build his case like he was arguing in front of a jury, and suddenly I saw him with absolute clarity. Not the charming man I'd fallen for at that wedding 3 years ago. Not the ambitious entrepreneur with big dreams and infectious confidence. Not even the insecure person demanding a prenup to protect himself. I saw someone whose entire identity was built on other people's perceptions. Someone who needed to be seen as successful more than he needed to actually be successful. Someone whose self-worth was so fragile that a partner's achievements felt like personal attack. His confidence had always been performance. His success a carefully maintained illusion. And now, faced with a fiancé who threatened that illusion simply by existing authentically, he wasn't asking me to join his life. He was asking me to shrink so he could stay big. Grant, I said softly, if you need me to disappear to feel whole, then we don't have a marriage. We have a performance. He stopped pacing, turned to face me. You're being dramatic. I'm not asking you to disappear. I'm asking for some discretion. You're asking me to legally bind myself to a lie. It's not a lie. His voice was rising again, frustration bleeding through. It's managing information. Being strategic about what we share. With everyone in our lives, I said. Forever. That's what an NDA means, Grant. I couldn't tell your mother, or our friends, or our future children, presumably. I'd have to hide who I am from everyone all the time so you can maintain the illusion that you're the successful one. Is that really so much to ask? The question came out almost pleading. After 3 years together, is some discretion really too high a price for our relationship? I felt something inside me finally, completely break. Not my heart exactly. Something deeper than that. The last thread of hope that Grant might somehow surprise me, might choose love over ego, might see me as a partner instead of a threat. Yes, I said simply. It is. His face twisted, frustration, anger, something that might have been genuine pain. You're going to throw away 3 years because you won't sign a simple document? That's what our relationship is worth to you. I picked up my purse from where I'd set it on his coffee table, my movements deliberate and calm even though my heart was hammering. Our relationship is worth everything to me, I said. But this. I gestured between us. This isn't a relationship anymore. It's a contract where I erase myself so you can feel superior. And I won't do that. Not for you. Not for anyone. I walked toward the door. Grant followed me, his voice getting louder, more desperate. You're being unreasonable. I'm trying to find a solution here. I'm trying to make this work and you're just throwing it all away. I turned at the door, looked at him one last time. Really looked at him. Tried to find the man I'd loved somewhere in the desperate, angry person standing in front of me. Grant, if you can't love me for who I actually am, all of me, including the parts that make you uncomfortable, then maybe we shouldn't get married at all. The silence that followed felt absolute, final. Grant's face cycled through emotions, shock, grief, fury, humiliation, before settling into something cold and hard. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You'll end up alone with nothing but your money to keep you warm. No one's going to want someone who lies for 3 years, who manipulates people. You think you're so smart, so successful, but you're just broken." The words were designed to hurt, and they did a little, but not the way he wanted them to. I met his gaze without flinching. Better alone with truth than chained to a lie. I opened the door and walked out. Behind me, I heard Grant say something else, but I didn't stop to listen. I closed the door quietly and walked down the hallway, down the stairs, out into the cool evening air, and I felt the weight of 3 years fall away like a coat I'd been wearing too long, heavy and suffocating, finally discarded. I made it to my car before the tears came. Not sobs, just silent tears streaming down my face as I sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at nothing. I wasn't even sure what I was crying about. The end of the relationship, the cruelty of Grant's final words, or the relief of finally being free from someone who needed me to be smaller. Maybe all of it. I drove home in a blur, wiped my face and went inside my apartment. It felt different somehow, lighter. Like something heavy that had been pressing on the walls had finally lifted. I texted Maya. "It's over." She called immediately. I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to talk yet. Instead, I made tea, sat on my couch and let myself feel everything I'd been holding back for weeks. The grief, the anger, the strange, unexpected relief. I fell asleep there, still in my clothes, the tea growing cold on the coffee table. The next morning, I woke to 17 missed calls and 23 text messages. My stomach dropped as I scrolled through them. They were from mutual friends, acquaintances, even people I barely knew, all with variations of the same question. Is it true? What happened? Grant said you've been lying to him? I opened the first voicemail. It was Jessica, the friend whose wedding had introduced us. "Paige, hey, I just talked to Grant and he's really upset. He said you've been hiding money from him? Like a lot of money? I'm so confused. Can you call me?" The second was from Tom, Grant's business partner. "Miss Calloway, this is Tom Hendricks. Grant's pretty torn up about everything and I just wanted to reach out because, well, I don't know what happened, but he's saying some things that sound pretty serious. If you could give me a call back, I'd appreciate it." I deleted the voicemails without listening to the rest. Grant had started talking, and apparently he'd started fast. Over the next 48 hours, the story spread through our social circle like a virus. Grant had called everyone, mutual friends, his business associates, people we'd met at parties or networking events. He'd crafted a narrative, polished and persuasive, painting himself as the victim of a calculated deception. I heard versions of it through the grapevine, through the awkward texts people sent asking for my side of the story. She lied to me for 3 years, pretended to be this modest, average person, then blindsided me with millions. Who does that? What kind of person manipulates someone like that? Some people believed him immediately. The story was bizarre enough to be compelling. Wealthy woman hides her money from unsuspecting fiancé, then ambushes him with the truth at a prenup signing. It had drama. It had betrayal. It had a clear villain, me. The texts kept coming. "Paige, is it true you've been hiding money from Grant? That seems really manipulative. Did you really ambush him at the lawyer's office? That's what Grant's saying. I don't want to take sides, but Grant seems really hurt. What happened?" I didn't respond to most of them. What was I supposed to say? That Grant had demanded a prenup assuming he had more to protect? That he'd tried to force me to sign an NDA about my own life? That he'd chosen his ego over our relationship? It all sounded defensive, like excuses. Then Tom called me directly. His voice was cold, professional, the warmth I'd heard at business dinners completely gone. "Miss Calloway, I don't know what game you're playing, but you've really hurt him. Grant's a good man. He didn't deserve whatever you did to him." I was quiet for a moment, weighing whether to engage. Finally, I said, "Ask him why he wanted the prenup in the first place." "What?" "Ask him why he felt he needed to protect his assets from me. Ask him what he thought I was going to take from him. Then maybe you'll understand what actually happened." The line went dead, but something shifted after that conversation. Maybe Tom actually asked the question. Maybe he started thinking about the logic of Grant's story. Because within a few days the narrative began to crack. People started asking uncomfortable questions. I heard them secondhand through Maya, through Eleanor, through the few friends who'd stayed neutral. "Wait, so Grant wanted a prenup because he thought he needed to protect himself from Paige? But then he's mad that she actually had more money? That doesn't make sense. He's angry because his fiancé is successful? That's what he's upset about. So he demanded financial disclosure, then got mad when the disclosure showed she was wealthier? Isn't that literally what he asked for?" The absurdity of it became impossible to ignore. I overheard the final nail in Grant's narrative's coffin completely by accident. I was at my usual coffee shop, working on my laptop in the corner, when two women sat down at the table next to me. They were talking loudly, the way people do when they don't think anyone's listening. "Did you hear about Grant Harrison?" one of them said. My fingers froze on the keyboard. "The real estate guy?" "Yeah, I heard he and his fiancée broke up. Something about money. He's been telling everyone she deceived him, hid her wealth, manipulated him. But my friend works with his lawyer and apparently the real story is that he demanded a prenup, then lost his mind when he found out she was richer than him. Like significantly richer." "Wait, seriously? So he's mad because his fiancée is accomplished?" "Exactly. Total ego problem. Imagine being threatened by your partner's success. God, that's pathetic. That's literally the dream. Marrying someone successful who doesn't need your money." They laughed and I sat there in my corner, invisible, feeling something close to vindication. Grant's smear campaign was backfiring spectacularly. His business associates started distancing themselves. I heard through Eleanor that potential investors were suddenly unreachable, calls going unreturned. Clients were asking pointed questions about his firm's stability, wondering if his personal drama indicated professional instability. The narrative he'd tried to control had escaped his grasp entirely. A week after I walked out of his loft, Margaret called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. "Paige." Her voice was tight, controlled, vibrating with barely suppressed fury. "We need to talk about what you've done to my son." I closed my eyes, already exhausted. "Margaret, do you have any idea what state he's in? He's depressed, barely working, drinking too much. All because you couldn't be honest about who you are." The accusation hung in the air and I felt anger rise in my chest, hot and righteous. "I was honest," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Grant never asked about my finances. He assumed I was financially simple and I let him because I wanted to be loved for me, not my bank account." "You lied by omission," Margaret shot back. "You let him build a life with you based on false assumptions." "He built assumptions," I corrected. "I never told him I was struggling. I never pretended to be someone I wasn't. He just never bothered to ask." There was a long pause. Then Margaret's voice shifted, softening into something almost pleading. "Paige, please, just sign the NDA. Let him save face. He's willing to proceed with the wedding if you'll just keep this quiet. Think about what you're throwing away." The audacity of it actually took my breath away. "You want me to marry a man who's ashamed of me?" I asked quietly. "Who needs me to hide who I am to protect his ego?" "It's not about shame," Margaret insisted. "It's about respect, about letting him be the man in the relationship." "No," I said, my voice cold now. "It's about his pride being more important than my truth. And I won't live that way. Not for him, not for you, not for anyone." I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking but I felt oddly calm. 2 weeks later, I received an email that surprised me more than anything else in this entire mess. The sender was Richard Brennan, Grant's lawyer. The subject line read, "Professional apology." I opened it, curiosity overriding caution. "Ms. Calloway, I wanted to reach out personally to apologize for my role in that disastrous prenup signing. In my 23 years practicing family law, I've never seen a client so fundamentally misunderstand his own position. For what it's worth, I've since advised Grant that his narrative isn't sustainable and that he should accept the relationship is over with dignity. He didn't take that advice well. I wish you all the best. Your attorney, Ms. Houghton, is excellent. You're in good hands. Respectfully, Richard Brennan." I read it 3 times, something loosening in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. Even Grant's own lawyer saw the truth. I forwarded the email to Eleanor. She responded within minutes. "Brennan's one of the good ones. Rare in this business. This is his professional way of saying Grant is delusional and you dodged a bullet." I smiled for the first time in weeks. That night, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, and realized something important. Grant had tried to control the narrative. He tried to make himself the victim, to paint me as the deceiver, to salvage his reputation at my expense. And it hadn't worked, because the truth, however strange or complicated, had a weight that his version of events couldn't match. I wasn't the villain in his story. I was just the woman who'd refused to shrink. The wine on my balcony that night tasted like freedom. I sat there for hours, watching the city lights blur and sharpen as clouds moved across the sky, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. Not the kind that comes from resolution or closure, but the kind that comes from simply surviving something you weren't sure you would. Grant's smear campaign had failed. His narrative had collapsed under its own weight, and I was still standing. But standing, I quickly learned, wasn't the same as thriving. The months that followed were harder than I'd expected. I threw myself into work with an intensity that worried even Eleanor. I expanded CloudSync Pro's features, adding modules I'd been planning for years but never had time to implement. I signed 2 new major clients, a national hotel chain and a logistics company that needed better inventory tracking. I traveled to 3 of my rental properties that needed attention, overseeing renovations and meeting with property managers. I was productive, successful, busy, and completely hollow. The nights were the worst. My apartment felt too quiet, my bed too empty. I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to text Grant about something funny that happened, a weird client request, a bizarre news article, anything, then remembering. The muscle memory of our relationship lingered long after the relationship itself had died. Maya visited often, showing up unannounced with takeout and wine, sitting with me in comfortable silence when words felt like too much effort. "You did the right thing," she'd say, unprompted, like she could sense my doubts. "I know it doesn't feel like it yet, but you did." I'd nod, wanting desperately to believe her. 3 months after the breakup, I started seeing a therapist. Dr. Chin was a calm, methodical woman in her 50s who had a way of asking questions that felt like gentle excavations, carefully unearthing things I'd buried. "Tell me about the secrecy," she said during our 4th session. "Not the practical reasons, the emotional ones." I shifted in the chair, uncomfortable. I wanted to be loved for me, not my money. "And you believe those things are separate? You and your money? They should be, Dr. Chin repeated. "But are they?" I didn't have an answer. "Did you hide your wealth to protect yourself?" she asked quietly. "Or to test him?" That question haunted me for weeks, because the truth was complicated. I'd hidden my wealth for both reasons. To protect myself from people who'd see me as a resource rather than a person, yes. But also, maybe, to see if Grant would love me without knowing the full picture. And when he'd failed that test, when he'd chosen his ego over our relationship, part of me had felt vindicated. But vindication, I was learning, wasn't the same as happiness. 4 months after the breakup, I ran into Grant. I was meeting Eleanor for lunch at a bistro downtown, early on a Tuesday. The place was half empty, quiet enough for conversation. Eleanor was running late. A court appearance had gone long, so I was sitting alone at our table, scrolling through my phone when I felt someone's gaze. I looked up. Grant was across the room, sitting with a man in a business suit I didn't recognize. A client, probably. Grant was mid-sentence, gesturing with his hands, but his eyes had found mine, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fall away. He looked different, thinner, older. The confident swagger I'd known so well had been replaced by something diminished, something careful. He said something to his client, then stood and walked over to my table. My heart was hammering, but I kept my face neutral. "Paige," he said. His voice was careful, stripped of emotion. "Neutral territory, Grant." An awkward silence stretched between us, thick with everything we'd said and everything we hadn't. "You look good," he offered finally. "Thank you." Another silence. Then Grant took a breath, like he was gathering courage. "I was an idiot," he said quietly. "I know that now." I waited, saying nothing. I let my pride destroy the best thing in my life. His voice was raw, honest in a way I'd rarely heard from him. "I've been seeing a therapist, working on myself, understanding why I reacted the way I did. And Paige, I'm sorry for everything, for the prenup, for the NDA, for making your success about my ego. I'm sorry." Part of me, the part that had loved him for 3 years, that had said yes when he proposed, that had imagined a whole life with him, wanted to reach across that gap, to accept the apology, to forgive, maybe even to try again. But I looked at him, really looked at him, and I realized something important. The man standing in front of me wasn't someone I wanted to rebuild with. He was someone I'd outgrown, someone I'd needed to outgrow. "I appreciate you saying that," I said gently. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Grant. I really do." His face flickered through emotions: hope, understanding, acceptance, resignation, before settling into something that looked like peace. He nodded. "Take care of yourself, Paige. You too." He walked back to his table. I watched him go, and when Eleanor arrived 5 minutes later, breathless and apologetic, I realized I was smiling. "Good news?" Eleanor asked, sliding into her seat. "Just closure," I said. Finally, 6 months after the breakup, Maya dragged me to a community fundraiser. I'd been resisting, making excuses about work, about being tired, about not being ready for social events. But Maya was relentless. "You need to get out of your apartment and remember there are good people in the world," she said firmly. "Also, you're volunteering whether you like it or not. I already signed you up." The fundraiser was for local schools, held at a community center that smelled like coffee and old books. There were donation tables, bake sales, volunteers sorting through boxes of supplies. It was chaotic and warm and overwhelmingly wholesome. That's where I met Daniel Torres. We were assigned to the same volunteer group, sorting donated books by age level and subject. He was wearing a t-shirt with a faded history pun on it, sneakers that had seen better days, and had the kind of smile that made you want to smile back. "Please tell me you're better at organizing than I am," he said, staring at the mountain of books in front of us. "Because I teach American history and I can barely keep my own classroom library alphabetized." I laughed, genuinely laughed for the first time in months. We sorted books and talked about his students, who he described with affection and exasperation, about my work which I kept vague, tech consulting pretty boring, about our shared love of terrible 80s movies, which we discovered when he made a reference to The Breakfast Club, and I immediately countered with a line from Ferris Bueller. At the end of the night he asked for my number, "Just so I can text you recommendations for bad movies," he said with a grin. Purely professional. I gave it to him. We had coffee 3 days later, then dinner the following week, then a movie, an intentionally terrible one from the 80s that we both loved ironically. On our 4th date, sitting on his small apartment balcony with cheap wine and pizza from the place down the street, I told him everything. About CloudSync Pro, about the royalties and the properties and the investments, about Grant and the prenup and the conference room confrontation, about hiding who I was because I'd been so afraid of being valued for what I had instead of who I was. I braced myself for the shift, the calculation, the change in his eyes. Daniel listened to everything without interrupting, his expression thoughtful and attentive. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled, genuinely, warmly, without reservation. "So you're smart and rich?" he said. Damn. I really hit the jackpot. I laughed so hard I nearly cried, relief flooding through me like sunlight breaking through months of clouds. "Paige," he continued, his tone more serious now, "I teach teenagers about the American Revolution for $52,000 a year. I drive a car that's old enough to vote. I'm not intimidated by your success. I'm impressed by it. You built something incredible. That's attractive." For the first time in years I felt truly seen. Not as a bank account, not as a threat to someone's ego, but as a whole person whose accomplishments were something to celebrate, not hide. "Your success doesn't scare me," Daniel said, reaching across the small table to squeeze my hand. "It inspires me." 6 months later, on a Sunday morning over pancakes at his place, Daniel proposed. Not with an expensive ring or elaborate plans. Just a simple question, asked with his whole heart in his eyes. "Want to build a life together? No prenup, no NDA, no conditions or clauses or legal protections. His love. Honest and unafraid." I said yes. Looking back now, I don't regret keeping my wealth private with Grant. It revealed his truth faster than honesty ever could. He'd wanted a prenup because he thought he was protecting himself from me. But in the end, the only thing he protected was his pride. And it cost him everything. I'm still Paige Calloway. Still 32. Still worth $9.5 million. Still driving that dented Honda, still living in my modest apartment, still shopping at Target. But now I know something I didn't before. Love built on pretense isn't love at all. It's fear wearing a ring. Real love looks like Daniel making terrible puns while we grocery shop. Like him proudly introducing me to his students' parents as my brilliant fiancé who builds software. Like splitting the check at dinner not because either of us has to, but because we want to be partners in everything. Real love doesn't ask you to shrink so someone else can feel tall. It celebrates you at your full height and says, "Look what we can build together." That's the ending I always deserved. And finally, I have it. If this story of Paige's ultimate power move had you hooked from start to finish, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Eleanor slid that thick folder across the table and Grant's face went completely white. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more empowering stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.